everyone hear me? It's good stuff? Cool. Before I begin, I wanted to thank everyone who's helped me in this process, particularly Dr. Gray, Dr. Grove, Dr. Westacott for helping me elongate this very short paper as it began. I'd also like to thank Dr. Emmons, who helped me figure out the genetics, which was insanely hard for me to understand sometimes, but she really helped me a lot, so I really appreciate that. And also I'd like to thank Dr. DeGraff for having the class that spurred on this paper. Without his class, I would never have written this, and it was a phenomenal class, so thank you very much, Dr. DeGraff. And finally, I'd like to thank my friend Elliot Severn, who stayed up with me until like 2 in the morning last night trying to figure out Microsoft PowerPoint, and I learned a lot. I don't know if I hate Microsoft now or if I love it, but thank you. So one last thing before I start. For everyone who may not be familiar with XMen, just wanted to give you a little background before the background of the XMen comic book series, which was started in the 1960s, and it followed the lives of a band of mutants, or humans with genetic mutations, some of which were good and some of which were bad. And over the years, it became a series of films. It's presently at the number 5. I think they're going to be making more. And they were a metaphor for discrimination against race, religion, and sexuality. So I hope you enjoy the paper. Thank you. Kicking X and Taking Genes, Genetic Mutation of X-Men. When we think of superheroes, science is not always the first thing to come into our minds. Usually, spandex is. Some might even say that the two have no connection whatsoever, but, as with life, science is present if you are willing to look for it. Take the film X-Men First Class, for example. Although the film is set in the past, it's plausible for future humans to mutate into X-Men copycats. The mutant Hank McCoy, alias Beast, on the left, is one of those who has plausible and obtainable mutations. His limbs are elongated, with enlarged hands and feet, which combine to improve his speed and agility to the point of simian qualities. He also possesses superhuman strength and intelligence. Even his blue and hairy exterior is genetically possible. Whether all of these changes are probable is a different question to be answered. Eric Lenscher, or Magneto, on the other hand, is not so believable. He holds telekinetic power over electromagnetic fields and is able to remotely manipulate metal, among other abilities. Why is it possible for my great-great-great-grandchildren to one day have Beast mutation? Why, however, is it impossible for those same descendants to have Magneto's power over metal? Both of these questions can be answered with science. No spandex required. For those who have lived under a rock for the past 50 years, X-Men is a serial comic that was first published by Marvel Comics in 1963. It concerns the lives of a band of mutants, or humans with genetic mutations, that not only fight evil, but also teach at a high school for mutant children. The leader of the X-Men was Charles Xavier, who possessed telepathic abilities. His arch-nemesis, Magneto, was known as Eric Lenscher in the films and as Max Eisenhart in the comics. Beast, aka Hank McCoy, was always a vital part of the X-Men team in both the comics and the films. The 4 films have never seemed married, or even dating the comic book series when it comes to one particular aspect. The explanation of mutants is markedly different between the two. In First Class, they are merely referred to as the evolutionary progression of humans. We are the next stage of human evolution. You said it yourself, Magneto says to Charles Xavier in X-Men First Class. This is one of the few topics the two frenemies agree on in both film and book. Science doesn't agree with the two, since mutation isn't caused by evolution. Evolution takes advantage of them, but does not cause them. In the comic series, however, mutations are said to be due not only to genetic happenstance, but by the emergence of a new gene, the X gene. Without this gene, mutations are said to be impossible. In film, the only reference to any sort of mutant gene is in X2. They discovered that it's the males who carry the mutant gene and pass it on, remarks a teenage mutant. This is the only tidbit of information on the mutant gene we are given in all 4 films. Before we discuss fictional mutation, we must first know what normal human mutation is. This will, I warn you, consist of that which may send some students running for the nearest exit. It's the way you came in, by the way. Science is coming for you, but I'll do my best to keep this from being a textbook. In simplest terms, human mutation occurs when a genetic material changes over time. I wish I could merely keep our definition to that, but this is science, and specificity is necessary. The genetic material in question is deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA. This complex molecule is made up of smaller molecules called nucleotides, and they are what form our genetic blueprint. Each nucleotide is made up of a nitrogenous base, which, oddly enough, contains nitrogen. Attached to this region is a carbon-based sugar molecule called deoxyribose. Think of it as a genetic version of the song about the skeleton, the hip bones connected to them, but only substituted with the nitrogenous base is connected to the sugar molecule. I won't embarrass myself and sing the song, but you get the idea. DNA is constructed by the linking of these half barbells. Each 5-carbon end of the nucleotide attaches to its neighboring nucleotide to create a string. They're like the Who's down in Whoville and at the end of Dr. Seuss's The Grinch, holding hands around the tree, only without the corniness and weird noses. But who am I to say anything about noses? So, another important facet to note about DNA are the 4 different types of nucleotides that create DNA. The nitrogenous base of a nucleotide is what differentiates one type of nucleotide from another. There are 4 kinds that make up DNA's structure: guanine, adenine, cytosine, and thymine. Thus, the difference in color between our diagram's nucleotides. They're each abbreviated to the first letter of each name, G, A, T, and C, because even scientists don't want to have to repeat those 4 words over and over again. This picture shows only one strand of DNA, whereas its most common form is in the shape of a double helix. The nitrogenous base creates the rungs of the ladders and link with opposing nucleotides. The glue that holds these rungs together are hydrogen bonds. These bonds are due to complementary base pairs. Those are our G's, T's, A's, and C's, finding love in their ladder. Unfortunately, the world of base pairing is strictly segregated. Only G's and C's, and only A's and T's, can find happiness together. So, to let my theater side out for a moment, nucleotides are like the Montagues and the Capulets of Romeo and Juliet. They don't approve of marrying into the other group. The only difference is that when Romeo and Juliet connect on this ladder, instead of the nucleotides dramatically killing themselves, a mutation occurs. There, the theater major has been let out long enough. The point is that the order these lettered lovers create is what produces the sequence, and therefore our genetic information. The sequence the nucleotides form are grouped into trios. Each side of our ladder is deciphered by proteins that help replicate the DNA, but also create proteins from amino acids. For each particular trio of nucleotides, or codons, there is a certain amino acid that is generated by the protein that reads the DNA. For example, the codon of CAG results in a glutamine amino acid. There are 2 other steps involved in this process, called transcription and translation. Although it is possible for mutation to pop up during these steps, I will be limiting my suppositions to code mutations, and therefore I won't detonate any more science bombs than I have to today. In the case of mutations, there are a number of ways the genetic sequence of DNA can be changed to create mutations. A type of mutation that can have a great effect on the chromosomal level is due to the insertion or deletion of either a pair of nucleotides or a single nucleotides. The insertion or deletion of a pair or a single nucleotide can create repeats in a certain sequence of DNA, as well as potentially moving a piece of chromosome to a different area. A frameshift mutation is very similar in that it involves insertions and deletions. When an insertion or deletion occurs, the sequence restacks itself, creating different codons. Since all the codons are shifting, the resulting amino acids are different than what they originally would have been. This mutation can result in many different genetic disorders, such as Tay-Sachs disease, a fatal affliction that results in mental and physical deterioration. Base substitutions, I'll let you deduce what those involve. Hint, it has to do with substituting base pairs, get it? Are also mutations that can have lasting effects. Some may think that this rarely happens and that people hardly are affected by them, but not so. One mutation that occurred in a sugar molecule is believed to have helped Homo erectus to thrive. The mutation helps the immune system of Homo erectus to recognize the malaria virus that still plagues chimps today as a threat. It is also thought that the changes in DNA sequence, called single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, contribute greatly to our genetic diversity. A SNP is a single nucleotide in the genome that differs from the other nucleotides in the species it belongs to. This DNA variation affects our reaction to diseases, and when melded with recombination of code, produces genetic mutation. This, and the fact that amino acids played a key role in our evolution from chimpanzees, proves that we are all mutants in a sense. Without these mutations, it is possible that humans could have evolved very differently. Does anyone here have blue eyes? Cool. You're all mutants, just so you know. So, Hans Eiberg of the Department of Cellular and Molecular Medicine at the University of Copenhagen states that, quote, a genetic mutation affecting the OCA2 gene in our chromosomes results in the creation of a switch. The switch limits its action, which reduces the production of melanin in the iris. In effect, the turned-down switch diluted brown eyes to blue. If the OCA2 gene had been completely shut down, our hair, eyes, and skin would be melaninless, a condition known as albinism, end quote. I hope I haven't created any tension between the browns and the blues in the room. So, the XMen mutants, however, are different in the sense that they don't utilize our centuries of scientific knowledge to draw conclusions. Thus, the concept that XMen mutations are caused by one specific gene, for example, is supposed to satisfy our scientific thirst, when in fact it's just like alcohol, or so they tell me. It creates insecurity with what we are told to be true by Stan Lee. If we are to believe that one gene is responsible for the mutations of XMen, we must assume that the huge array of diverse mutant abilities is due to variations in the gene. It would be more believable, however, if the mutation was polygenic, which is when a trait is due to the expression of a combination of genes as opposed to a single gene. The idea, however, that men are the only ones who pass on the gene is a good example of the lack of hard science present in the X-Men films. Genetic mutations that are passed on occur in the sperm and egg cells, or the sex cells of a person. Due to the sprinkling of information regarding the X gene, there are only two possible ways in which both males and females express it, without females having the capability of passing it on. One of these possibilities is through epigenetic tagging, or DNA methylation. This is when non-genetic factors, such as environment, change how genes express themselves. As cells divide during sex cell production, males and females add methyl groups, like little tags, to their sequences of DNA. But depending on the sex of the person, some genes change and are passed on, while others are not. How the parent's sex affects the gene is then passed to their offspring, so it is possible that the X gene is epigenetically altered during sex cell production in males, and this results in this altered active gene being passed to offspring. The only other way this would be possible is if the X gene was a dominant allele, aka a specific gene that causes a certain trait, in this case, superpowers. But females didn't express this dominant gene when producing sex cells. This would explain how females could express the trait themselves, but not pass it to their children unless an affected sperm was utilized. Knowing the patterns of genetic mutation, we can now analyze the possibility of our descendants evolving into beast-like humans. Beast's original mutation, this is one of his many problems that he has to deal with, being Beast. Big feet and bigger shoes. So, Beast's original mutation consists of extended arms and legs and enlarged hands and feet. This enhances speed, agility, flexibility, and other physical attributes. Small example of what he
I'm sorry.
There we go. Beast is not naturally blue and furry, by the way. This is the side effect of a faulty drug, as the film portrays. Amazingly, however, this trait is actually more genetically possible than some of the other mutations X-Men are said to have. Blue skin is due to an excess amount of methemoglobin in the blood. This is a type of hemoglobin that is more oxidant than normal, thus causing blue skin. Oddly, the blood of those affected is brown, while the skin is smurfish in color. Thanks to good fortune, there is a perfect genetic example of this in Kentucky. Meet the Fugates of Kentucky. They have shown this recessive trait since the 1800s, and their descendants to this day express the trait, as you can see. I know, this isn't actually a mutation in the series, but hey, Smurfs exist. I thought you'd like to know. Now let's get back to the real mutations at hand. The qualities of Beast's original mutation were all very simian, and thus could have been attributed to atavism, which is a rare mutation in which a person is born with physical aspects of an evolutionary ancestor. Although uncommon, this has occurred in the recent past. One man was born with a snake-like heart. The heart was a 3-chambered heart, unlike our own 4-chambered organ, and circulated the blood in the same way as a reptile. If it's possible for someone to to have the heart of a snake, a very distant evolutionary relative, then it could be possible for someone to have simian features, a much closer ancestor. We've already seen this happen in humans, not to the same extent as beast, but very close. The Nuer tribe in southwest Ethiopia shows evolutionary adaptation at its finest. Since these people live in a very hot area, their bodies are tall and thin to aid in cooling. Their legs appear to be 75% of their body mass, and they are inherently slim people, just like beast physiology. All these aspects make their bodies the ultimate air conditioners, and this all occurred through years of evolutionary adaptation. Although this is not technically genetic mutation, even evolutionary adaptation has a biological beginning. In order for these people's bodies to develop the way they did, genetic selection must have occurred. The most likely genetic abnormality that occurred would have happened involving the SHOX gene. This stands for short stature homeobox gene and is located on the X and Y chromosomes. It has been attributed to how humans develop in height. When this gene mutates, it can cause shortness in people. Since Hank McCoy is said to be very tall, it's possible that his SHOX genes could be abnormal, or he could have extra copies of them. For the Nuer people, the trait of height is evolutionary advantageous. And not only was natural selection most likely the instigator for these biological changes, but epigenetics also factors into the equation. Epigenetics, as I said before, is when changes in gene expression are due to outside factors and without changes in DNA sequence. For example, recent studies showed that rat pups that were often licked by their mother had less tightly wound strings of DNA and were less high-strung. So this is what a DNA strand would look like from a well-licked pup. It seems the phrase tightly wound may have a scientific basis. The conditions surrounding the Nuer people most likely affected the expression of their genes as they developed. McCoy's long toes could be due to a mutation on the FBN1 gene on chromosome 15. This mutation has been linked to the genetic disorder Marfan syndrome, the symptoms of which include long arms, legs, fingers, and toes. Scientists have yet to definitely pinpoint the correlation between these physical attributes and the FBN1 gene. Another aspect of Beast's mutation was his superior intellect. In the comics and films, he not only has PhDs in biophysics and genetics, he also has a vast knowledge of literature, math, psychology, and science. The concept of whether intelligence is innate or learned is controversial, but in biological terms, some brains are more capable of intelligence than others. One possible reason for Beast's smarts could be neoteny. This isn't a scientific representation, but sometimes Google does let you down. So. Neoteny is the retention of underdeveloped or juvenile features. Now, this can cause a number of different physical abnormalities, such as broad facial structure and small teeth, like me, one of which is slow brain development. Some experts believe that the brain is able to learn most during childhood. Since neoteny means a longer period of physical development, it might explain Beast's knowledge-rich cranium. Another factor to consider is that accelerated brain maturation is thought to reduce one's intellectual capabilities. People with baby faces resulting from neoteny are found to have an above-average intellect. Neoteny also causes abnormally large brain size. This could be another correlation to Beast's natural smarts, since large brains have been linked to higher IQs in humans. Genetically, IQ has been linked to the interactions of two or more genes, aka a polygenic trait. However, this trait is still at the center of an age-old argument of nurture over nature. In terms of genetics, intelligence has yet to be pinpointed as an inherited trait. On to the villain's corner of the mutation spectrum. Magneto is arguably one of the most complex and intriguing villains of the comic book world. His story begins in the concentration camps of Nazi Germany, where the horrid conditions surrounding him result in the genesis of his powers. In the film, Magneto's powers are never fully discussed, but, not surprisingly, they are within the comics. Magneto has power not over metal, as the film would have you believe, but over electromagnetic fields. This is an important distinction, because it enables him to use his powers in many different ways. In one issue of Uncanny XMen, Magneto creates a wormhole in space. This would have been impossible for the character if he merely had control over metal. He turned himself invisible in one episode by shifting visible light around his body and he has been known to generate the odd force field here and there. Obviously, his powers are much more unlimited than demonstrated in the films. Now we must delve into the messy task of the stalwart implausibility of Magneto's powers. There is no denying that Magneto is a phenomenal character and without a doubt one of my favorite comic book heroes. Villains. His powers, however, are simply over electromagnetic fields. A charged object that is moving produces both electric and magnetic fields, whereas non-moving charged objects only produce electric fields. These two types of fields interact to create electromagnetic fields. There are some animals that are able to sense these electromagnetic fields. This is called magnetoception. One animal with this trait and ability is the shark. I warn anyone who is a little bit queasy about blood might not want to look at this clip, just so you know. I think it's cool though. The head of the shark is equipped with ampullae of Lorenzini, or pores filled with jelly-like liquid. Each pore is a bundle of sensory cells and nerve fibers that sense the frequency in the water that the jelly comes in contact with. The jelly is actually protein with electrical conductivity. These pores sense voltage differences in water and help sharks navigate. So, this is how they move around. Birds are another animal that use magnetoception to direct themselves. Their beaks have a biological version of magnetite, a ferromagnetic mineral, which aids in their flight. The mineral in their beaks sense magnetic fields of the Earth and thus orient the bird. Another possible alternative for their navigation is that the selections of homing pigeons' brains process magnetic information. It is still being debated whether beaks or brains are the driving force behind the inherent navigation of birds. Despite our fish ancestors, we have yet to develop the ampullae of Lorenzini of sharks. I doubt highly that we will be able to be growing beaks anytime soon, and our brains are still unable to detect magnetic fields. Let's bend reality, though, for a moment, and say that we could. Even with those jelly-filled pores, observant brains, and mineral-rich beaks, we would still only be able to sense electromagnetic fields, not control them in any way. Now we must add telekinesis to this crazy stew. Telekinesis, also known as psychokinesis, is defined as the ability to move or alter objects remotely using mental concentration. Were telekinesis to exist, it would break multiple laws of physics. Sir Isaac Newton's third law of physics states that with every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Thankfully, in one of Bryan Singer's films of XMen, he gives us a perfect example of this with superheroes. We have no way of knowing if the object in question causes a reactive force because there are no laws of telekinesis. Newton's first law of physics dictates that the velocity of a body remains constant unless the body is acted upon by an external force. Therefore, without physical contact, electromagnetic fields, or gravitational fields, an object cannot be moved. The mind cannot control gravitational or electromagnetic fields, and since using physical contact would be cheating, telekinesis is impossible. Another law that telekinesis breaks is the inverse square law. This example is using light as an example. In simple terms, this law states that energy grows weaker as it travels distances. Since distance affects any type of energy greatly, then using brain power would only work if its subject was extremely close, and that's assuming brains have remote powers. So for instance, the simple task of lifting a submarine that Magneto takes on would be 10 times more difficult if he was 10 times farther away. In the comic book world, apparently it's possible for a mind to control electromagnetic fields. But here in the real world, The brain does not have the capability to lift a submarine out of the water. Obviously, mutation can be caused by multiple of physiological developments, and the human body is able to adapt to various environmental conditions. But there are some things it is incapable of producing. Long arms and legs, definitely possible. Abnormally high intelligence, absolutely if we're going to go by brain size. Magnetoception, probably not. Telekinesis, impossible. There are exceptions to each of these responses, but we must remember that the pinch of science that was sprinkled into this series was most likely added to appease a Marvel exec who said, but how does all this mutation stuff happen? What happens with it? Trying to unearth hard science from a comic book series is as easy as finding fossils in a child's sandbox. You might find some cat bones, but mostly it's just sand. I doubt without the help of toxic chemicals, radiation, or other Marvel cliches, the human race will ever be able to reach the pinnacle of Magneto's mutation. Whether or not we evolve into Beast is entirely up to the luck of the genetic draw, but I hope that if this occurs, we will react to it better than our film counterparts. Science fiction has always had an uncanny ability to predict the future, with its touchscreens and powerful computers. So if Stan Lee has been blessed with this gift, then I hope his prediction of our reaction to mutants does not materialize. I'd like to think that by the time another socially different group emerges, such as mutants, we have learned enough from the past to accept them and to not attack them. Thank you.